There's a place for us. Somewhere, a place for us. So sing the star-crossed lovers Tony and Maria in Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim's West Side Story. It expresses their hope that despite everyone in their lives trying to keep them apart, there may still well be a small corner in the world where they can get their happily ever after. We ask today, is there still a place for doctrine in the church? Is there still somewhere for doctrine in theological discourse? Is there still somewhere for doctrine in the secular university? For many, doctrine has become a dirty word, an authoritarian tool more suited to a pre-Enlightenment world. Or if doctrine is to be engaged, it is as a historical pursuit, reporting on what the church has presented as their beliefs in different times and places. But if theology is lured by the eternal, surely it cannot be satisfied in the archives. Perhaps the issue is the way doctrine is perceived as dusty, still, stern. Perhaps it's the way its human construction has been ignored, or the way its subject has been sidelined. Whatever it is, the question must be raised, have we reached the end of doctrine? My guest today tackles this question head on. In her work, Theology and the End of Doctrine, she tells the story of how we got here, problematizes the revival of doctrinal interest by the cultural-linguistic school in the 80s, and offers her own constructive proposal for the relationship of doctrine to theology and the lived experience of faith. In the introduction of her work, she writes, "So the end of doctrine heralded in the title of this book also signals a beginning. What about doctrine reconceived as an invitation to consider and engage the living God? Doctrine as a guide to discerning God's actions in individual lives, within communities, and in history. If this becomes the end of doctrine, end in the sense of purpose and project, then there is no end to doctrine." Perhaps in the end, things could work out better for doctrine and the church than for Tony and Maria. Spoiler alert. My name is Liam Miller. This is the Love, Rinse, Repeat podcast, and my guest today is Professor Christine Helmer. So maybe just to get us started and get people knowing a bit of who you are, we're going to be talking about your book, Theology and the End of Doctrine, but what drew you to, maybe not even the book necessarily, but just well before that, casting our minds back, what started to draw you to the idea of theology as a type of thought that you'd be interested in?
Well, that's going to take me back a couple of decades. I remember being really inspired by seeing a female clergy person when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I remember thinking that's what I really want to be. But when I got to seminary, I realized that there was this whole world of systematic theology out there, and math was one of my favorite subjects in high school, and I thought putting the mathematical or logical or philosophical thinking to work for theology, that might work. One of the other interests that I had was Martin Luther, and because I'm Lutheran, and I became interested in Luther because there were so many cliches, so many doctrines and cliches that were circulating around Luther that I decided to actually roll up my sleeves and study him in detail. And then when I got to my dissertation, I was hooked, and I haven't yet looked back.
That's excellent. Well, we're going to get to Luther again later in the interview with your new project, but for now, Theology and the End of Doctrine. Theology has to do with the study of doctrine, so begins your excellent work. However, there's no doubt that many in our age are going to push back on that idea, push back on the whole idea of doctrine, especially if we're positing doctrine as something positive and living, and that Christians should be engaged in considering. So how did we get to the point where doctrine was such a dirty word? And maybe you might need to narrow the focus of that. You don't have to give us the whole big picture, but maybe to put it another way, how did we get to the point that you were like, I know what book I need to write?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I was trained at Yale in kind of the heyday of the Yale School of Theology, and doctrine was very much in the kind of in the air. People were very, very interested in doctrine for reasons of looking back at the history of theology and looking at questions of how the church could have some unity across the centuries. So doctrine was very important. George Lindbeck had come out with his famous book, The Nature of Doctrine. So doctrine was actually a really positive word when I was studying at Yale. However, I decided after Yale to study the early 19th century philosopher and theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who at Yale wasn't so much a welcome guest at conversations. And Schleiermacher was famous for having constructed an epistemology, or a way of knowing theology, before he would actually get to the constructive theological work of producing doctrines. So I was very much interested in how one thinks in such a way as to produce doctrines, as opposed to what I had been trained to do, which is just go ahead and construct doctrine. So ways of knowing became a very important question to me. Also in light of various sort of liberation, experiential, and contextual theologies, where people from particular contexts who were traditionally excluded from the production of doctrine in the traditional dogmatic way of German and Anglo-American thought, that different ways of knowing were coming to the fore. Feminist, womanist ways of knowing, African-American ways of knowing. So there was an interest in how one knows in a critical and constructive way that was actually critical of the dominant paradigm.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. So, kind of early in your book, you write about how personal biography, political context, and relationships with the church and the Christian community all contribute to the shape of the questions a theologian asks. So doctrine is this idea of being constructed, shaped by the language of the day and for a living audience. But you also write, sometimes there is disruption, where a theologian is brought up short. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this interplay between the kind of particular and the transcendent, or the biographical and the beyond, which may give you a chance to tease your more recent project, but yeah, I'll open up to you.
Yeah, the assumption about doctrine is that it's something that's normative, that it is produced for church leadership, or it is produced by some people who have a lot of power in the church and imposed upon everybody else. And I really wanted to get away from that notion of doctrine for, I think, historical reasons, as well as personal and biographical reasons. The historical reasons have to do with how doctrine was produced in the past. People had questions. People were trying to figure things out. Who is Christ? Why is Christ a transformative presence in our lives? What does the Spirit have to do with the second person of the Trinity? Or when we move further along into the Middle Ages, we see questions about Mariology being asked by people who are pious, people who don't have any theological training. So doctrine does tend to be produced by people's experiences of God, of the Trinity, of each other. And so I really wanted to tap into that sort of experiential and productive notion of doctrine that I think taps into kind of the living dimension of Christianity. So, moving doctrine away from something that is received as normative, that's already scripted, that's already kind of imposed, I think really takes people's ownership to discovering doctrine, or allowing doctrine to shape their worldviews, shape their own particular experiences of God and of each other. I wanted to move away from that notion and shift the attention to doctrine as being produced historically, and then, as I said, personally. My first book was on Luther's Doctrine of the Trinity, and I find the Doctrine of the Trinity this kind of amazing doctrine that combines logic, which is sort of not logical, and mystical experiences. There have been some wonderful visions that particularly women have had about the Trinitarian mystery, and I think that my attraction to the doctrine of the Trinity has to do with this sort of particular combination or balance between the mystical and the mathematical, logical, that can't really ever get resolved, but that presents itself as a problem begging to be investigated further.
You mean 3 doesn't just simply equal 1? That's wild. Something that builds on this point also is that, theology studies the eternal reality. It is lured by eternity. How do you think this shifts the treatment of doctrine, which kind of has become that increasingly historicist view of just studying what Christians at certain times believed or said they believed? And how does it impact this idea of a potential for surprise and disruption?
Yeah, this is where I think Schleiermacher comes in as a really important and necessary conversation partner, because Schleiermacher was a theologian who approached the construction of theology through a Kant's critical philosophy, which is basically you can't kind of just make claims about God. You have to talk about God's relationship to humans, and you can make claims about God only in relationship to humans, in relationship to history, in relationship to individuals. So the kind of perspective on God is always going to be couched or framed from an individual or a communal perspective that is historically rooted in a religious community and in a particular cultural context. So the kind of the angle or the perspective on eternity is always going to be mitigated through sort of finite structures of knowing, and then culturally conditioned by language, society, politics, and also the individual contributions to that.
So now Schleiermacher's in the air, I think this is a good place to ask this question, because when you were in Melbourne and talking at Pilgrim Theological College, you quipped that you're there to spread the good news of Friedrich Schleiermacher, to advocate for Schleiermacher. He's been so often maligned and set up as, in the book, you kind of talk about in air quotations, the problem of Schleiermacher as conceived. And I was, for my 30th birthday, someone very graciously and kindly gave me the Christian Faith, the new thing. So maybe even going beyond the project of theology and the end of doctrine, maybe you can just give your elevator pitch for why I should crack open this book, or why, because it looks very nice, it looks beautiful, I'm excited, but why I should, or why others should, give Schleiermacher a chance. What did he get right? What have we got wrong? What's the elevator pitch for looking again at the father of liberal Protestantism?
Yeah, the happy birthday. If it's your 30th birthday, you can celebrate together with Schleiermacher, whose 250th birthday will be celebrated in Berlin in November. So lots of birthday kennels to go around. I think I kind of always carrying a torch for Schleiermacher, because in just kind of general theology, Schleiermacher is always cast aside as a negative foil. So there are comments made about, I'm not doing what Schleiermacher did, and I think that usually comes from not really having taken the time to get to know how Schleiermacher thinks and how he really does wrestle with some very, very important theological questions that are pertinent today. For example, Schleiermacher taught me, I think, a very important lesson about how theology is an endeavor that is embodied in intersubjective conversations. That there's no such thing as knowledge that one can derive out of one's own kind of limited consciousness, but that theology is only as good as one's conversations. And so Schleiermacher, in his Christian Faith, which is the 2-volume toe stomper that you received for your birthday, in his Christian Faith, he's always engaged in dialogue with his conversation partners, and that's something to pay attention to. Another aspect of Schleiermacher's thought that I think is really important is he really considers Christ's transformative work to be central to Christianity. Christ is the absolute center of Christianity, and Christ cannot be thought of without the church. So Christ and the community together constitute the central pillars of Schleiermacher's Christian faith. You can't have Christ without the community. And I think in that way, that brings Protestant theology that tends to look at Christ in some sort of independence from the community, much closer to a Catholic notion that Christ is only available or accessible or communicated through the community. So that kind of relationship is something that Schleiermacher taught me in my own work.
Excellent. All right. I have my summer reading all prepared. So an important section in your book, in Theology and the End of Doctrine, is your critique of the epistemic model of doctrine, which situates doctrine as a grammar of a worldview, where doctrine rather than God norms the Christian community. This kind of is a dogmatism of the rule of faith, is able to kind of isolate from critical questions emerging in the present or the future. Could you expand a little bit on this section, on this critique that you build? And I guess perhaps tell me why that, since as I'm reading this section, I can't help thinking that in our contemporary climate, these kind of problems that come from this model will only, snowball further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I think something I've been thinking about as well since the book was published, and the kind of epistemic advantage model, which is a kind of a combination between a postmodern language-oriented worldview. I mean, that's what I was trying to capture. Seems to me to be open to sort of a problematic metaphysic, that one can actually build one's own worldview irrespective of how language works in relationship to reality, that one can build that worldview, that religious worldview, using doctrine as a grammar and having the kind of self-referential function of language kind of create this worldview. I can't but think that this is open to something like alternative facts, and so I think that the notion of building some kind of a doctrine without really taking seriously how language is related to reality and how reality can actually shape the formulation of linguistic propositions in a particular way. I think that's really important. So I did want to bring the kind of referential notion of language back into the study of theology, where I think it really has been excised. I really wanted to bring experience back into the production of doctrine. And I think given current kind of political struggles between alternative facts and facts, I really think that getting clear on how language and reality work theologically is actually going to be politically advantageous.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's really insightful. So, just thinking about you've looked at doctrine and put a proposal for what doctrine could be, should be trying to achieve at the very least. There seems to be a bit of a renewed emphasis on doctrinal work coming out of the theological circles these days. I remember Catherine Sonderegger talking about how there's a little less kind of throat clearing going on now, and a little more just saying what we actually constructive doctrinal work kind of. So I guess what doctrinal, what theological work has been exciting you of late?
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. The time of of what I call performing normativity from the past is I'm hopeful that it's over. So there have been so many companions to and to doctrines in the past, to people in the past, and I think that in order to really look at our world today, which is very, very different than it was 10 years ago, to look at our world today, look at the political situation on the global sphere, look at the sort of catastrophic pronouncements made about climate change. I'm looking very, very seriously at our world today, and trying to work theologically in order to make sense of a God whose providence of this world might not dovetail very easily with what we're seeing politically, as well as in terms of the climate. So I think the time really is right now for looking at theology in view of the world having a terminus ad quem, having an end, and what does that mean for all our concepts? What does that mean for hope? What does that mean for justice, climate justice, and justice for marginalized populations? And what does that say about God when the models that we've had, the doctrinal models that we've had about God, all have presupposed a linear progress narrative where things are going to turn out well? So I think we have a lot of work to do given the real urgencies of our time, and I think it's time that theologians roll up their sleeves and really begin to address the topics that are presenting themselves on our newsreels every day.
Thank you. So, shifting gears to your new work, How Luther Became the Reformer, available for pre-order now. And so, could you give us maybe a little sneak peek behind the curtain of what appears to be, if I may be so bold, not your grandpa's Luther biography?
Oh yeah, well, the book, and thank you so much for mentioning it. Yes, it will be available in March. The book was actually written this year, 2018, which is the year after 2017, the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And last year, as a Luther scholar, I saw many people around the world becoming very interested in Luther, writing these biographies of Luther that had to do with Luther beginning modernity in some way, Luther at the origins of modernity. And I have spent, I would say, the better part of 3 decades trying to figure out how Luther was not a modern, but that Luther was actually a late medieval Augustinian friar who did not intend to launch modernity by hammering the 95 Theses into the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, but that he was very interested in particular theological reforms of late medieval Catholicism. So all this celebration of Luther as a sort of triumphalist modern made me, I must admit, rather cranky. And so I wrote the book in order to disclose historically where that triumphalist narrative of Luther as at the origins of modernity actually began. And so I dug into the early part of the 20th century, particularly in Germany, and saw that the German Lutheran theologians were very interested in promoting a certain kind of Luther that would also help Germany consolidate its sort of national ethos around a modern ethos. What is very ironic is that this celebration of Luther, with the particular biographical details that we all know so well, that many Luther scholars have actually debunked as kind of historical fiction, this image of Luther as triumphalist modern was really being heralded in Germany at a time when Germany was losing the First World War. So between 1914 and 1918, Luther was being heralded for particular purposes of cultural unity in Germany, and Germany was losing the First World War. So there's this kind of ironic sense that Luther's function in German society was sort of elevated against the backdrop of the real demise of the country. I also then wanted to kind of address some of these analogies that people have been drawing between our contemporary decade and the fragile Weimar democracy of the 20s that ended up becoming demolished with the rise of fascism. So I know that analogy has been drawn, but I wanted to kind of investigate that a little bit further through the lens of Luther.
Yeah, it seems like a fascinating way into it, because again, a lot of broad brush parallels are drawn to that era, but seeing how, particularly the way history is remembered, which is obviously a big thing at play at the moment with the way the Civil War is kind of being reimagined, reinterpreted, the way Civil War figures in the way of monuments are becoming contested space. To go in through the way that we construct historical figures to establish national narratives it seems like fruitful ground.
Yes, and Luther was very much used for that, even in the 1870s in Germany, in the cultural struggle, the Kulturkampf that Bismarck had begun against the Roman Catholics, and very much looking at Luther as a cultural unifier in the 1870s in a country where 30% of the population was Roman Catholic. To me, that seems very much a political ideology being kind of enforced and extended into the culture. There are also these kind of interesting claims that the scholars, they were theologians, they were sociologists, they were historians and historians of religion at the time who were interested in formulating a concept of religion that could be fruitful for understanding Luther as a religious figure rather than as a systematic theologian. So there's a very kind of interesting confluence of interdisciplinary work in the German universities at the time, trying to kind of work historically and sociologically on a concept of religion. We take it for granted that the concept of religion has been around a lot. It's a contested term, of course, in the study of religion, but it does have a particular origin with particular interests, and I do work on some of those interests, especially because Luther was the kind of was touted as the religious guru or religious virtuoso par excellence in these early attempts to look at Luther's biography as being the point at which the shift from the Middle Ages to early modernity took place.
Well, that's excellent, and I'm sure everyone is very excited after that teaser to pick that up or pre-order it now. Get it in while you're doing all your Christmas shopping. It's only an extra little bit of money, no one will notice. So Professor Christine Helmer, anything you'd like to promote, plug? How can people reach out, connect with you? If they want to take a class, what should they do? How do we stay in touch?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I do have a free online course called Luther in the West. It is on the Coursera.org website. There are 36 short articles, as well as videos on Luther and his impact on the West, from biblical interpretation to notions of freedom to church-state relations. So that's a kind of an introduction to theological history through the lens of Luther.
Yeah, that's excellent. And Theology and the End of Doctrine is out now. You can get it anywhere that sells good books, I assume, and or at least very much online. And How Luther Became the Reformer, out in March. Professor Christine Helmer, thank you very much for joining us today on Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your podcast, and I wish you all the very best in your work in distributing and disseminating theological information in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.